Did the visit to China change your perspective in any way?
A very impressive place, and I can see why they're an international superpower. They're tough negotiators and certainly very organized and well briefed. You get to meetings, it gets straight down to business, you get into the brass tacks. There's no sort of posturing in that. You know exactly what they want and what they expect from you. I've got a duty to get my produce of our farmers and farm workers into as many international markets as possible, and that means going to places like China. They're a huge market and a very important ally for us to take it. But I think their determined focus on growth, on economic development, is something that...
What is your stance as a government of national unity, first coming from a Democratic Alliance perspective? I saw you were with the president when you went to FOCAC in China, Beijing. You are maybe also going to BRICS summit in Russia, and also the G20 is coming within the country. What is the main posture point of the government of national unity, and from a Democratic Alliance perspective, looking at the divergent views of these two big parties in the GNU?
So I think that the focus from a government perspective is certainly growth and jobs. That is the key focus of the medium-term development plan. How do we create more jobs? How do we grow the economy? And so we have to look pragmatically around the globe to see where are the opportunities for South Africa. As the Minister of Agriculture, I've got a duty to get my produce of our farmers and farm workers into as many international markets as possible. And that means going to places like China. They're a huge market and a very important ally for us in the trade environment. We are part of BRICS. I mean, the DA's last Congress accepted that we are part of BRICS, and we must now leverage that to make a difference. And I'm going to use our membership of those multilateral organizations to be able to make a case for South Africa's agricultural products there. Why do we have import tariffs of apples into India that's so high when we're a BRICS country? Why is China giving Australia favoured access from wine when we're a BRICS country? You should be getting South African wine there, and our wine's much better as well. So you've got to look at these things from a pragmatic perspective from government. But at the same time, I think you must be mindful not to get involved in situations that irritate a situation. So I don't think that... And I think you've seen a far more pragmatic approach from Minister Tao and others around the renegotiation of AGOA, approaching it not from a slavish ideological perspective, but actually we need AGOA because it helps our trade and industry in South Africa, and we need that agreement to work, but it must also work for us. And so in these approaches to international relations, I always use India as a very good example. India look at each situation and decide what is in the best interest of India in this particular situation, and then they make their interventions or their positions clear on their interest. And I think that South Africa needs to use our membership in both a South-South and a North-South axis to be able to leverage more opportunities for South Africa in produce, products and industry.
Did the visit to China change your perspective in any way, particularly on how the Chinese state operates in its relations to its other trading partners, particularly within the African continent and South Africa?
Yeah, they're tough negotiators and certainly very organized and well briefed. You get to meetings, it gets straight down to business, you get into the brass tacks. There's no sort of posturing in that. You know exactly what they want and what they expect from you. And I found that a very refreshing approach, and I'm quite a direct person as well. And so it worked well for me. But I can see why they're an international superpower. They take their economy and growth incredibly seriously. And it's what drives their foreign policy and their approach around the world. We signed some really good protocols there that I think are more beneficial for South Africa than for China, giving us access to their markets for dairy and processed dairy products. The foot and mouth protocol that we've signed, which will keep our industry, our beef industry, able to supply them even during foot and mouth outbreaks, will, etc. And the other work that was done around investment in infrastructure, very important as well. So a very impressive place, the most conspicuous consumption I've seen in a long time, beautiful cities, but certainly lots to learn as well. Beijing, I was expecting to be congested and smoky. It was very well run, beautifully manicured and looked after, and dead quiet. Almost 90% of the vehicles on their roads are electric vehicles now. You don't have the fumes, you don't have the noise. It's almost eerie walking in their downtown CBD of Beijing, and it's virtually dead quiet because you don't have vehicle noises. So I think they're like every country, there are lessons we can draw from there and take it. But I think their determined focus on growth, on economic development, is something that we could take a leaf from.
So during the last FOCAC meeting between China and many African countries, I know many of you were actually surprised to see the likes of John Steenhuisen and many representatives of the DA, there in China and actually commemorating with President Cyril Ramaphosa at the level of government. Meanwhile, the DA was actually always represented as that center-right party that had more affiliations to the West, like the US and Western powers. But now it appears that the DEA now, because of the government of national unity, seems to be shifting east, and that's what DEA leader here, John Steenhuisen, actually trying to explain that at the level of government, especially as Minister of Agriculture, he had to really change his perspective to really start seeing the possibilities of stretching South Africa, especially South Africa being a major player in agriculture in the world, to start expanding the market so that South Africa doesn't operate from a perspective of a disadvantage. And that's actually what's actually going on here, where you see he explains how China and the BRICS are actually a really important player, for South Africa, especially from the perspective of a Minister of Agriculture. But I saw some really interesting facts by, the Daily Maverick on the trade wars between US and China, and how if South Africa is not careful, it will also be affected in that. And that's why John Steenhuisen is actually taking this stance, in where he's slowly becoming an admirer of China, you see, and in that regard. But anyway, we know that trade, in terms of the trade wars, okay, Donald Trump's trade war, against China were interpreted as being anathema to the letter and the spirit of open international trade, all right? So there's a trade war between the US and China. We know that, especially particularly in the agricultural exports to China, China's more than 1 billion population suddenly needed to find alternative sources after the ban on the US. So it shows that the data shows that South Africa's exports to China moved from 1.4 billion in 2017 to 2.97 billion in 2018 because of the trade wars the US and China now had. So South Africa now had to really fill in that gap. So in other words, for John Steenhuisen, it then became redundant to slowly to keep on denigrating relationships with the East, especially with China and Russia, in the face of this ban, since South Africa could actually become a player to fill up that gap that was open as a result of sanctions from the US on China, especially in the perspective of agriculture. So it says that indeed, South Africa's exports of these products to China have grown without interruption. China's import of meat from South Africa has actually also, although not been successful or consistent, nonetheless. But anyway, although the figure jumped from 57 million rand to 355 million rand between 2017 and 2018, and then it peaked in 2020 at 698 million rand, it has been climbing down. It has since been climbing down and was at 32.5 million as of 2023. So John Steenhuisen now wants to try to boost that up, because that was a really major market for South Africa during this time. But anyway, it argues that the fall in the exports to China anyway has been in part due to other exporters, especially fellow BRICS members like Brazil, out competing South Africa for access to the Chinese market and filling the space left by the US. So in other words, South Africa has to now be a little bit more aggressive in its competition with BRICS. And so it then slowly, highlights this shift towards the East that John Steenhuisen as Minister of Agriculture is now slowly really realizing and slowly aligning with, because based on the sanctions that have been imposed on China by the US, it remains an opportunity. And that's the nature of international trade, you see, because what might be an opportunity for one might be a threat for another. And South Africa, being a country that still suffers from a high unemployment rate and, a lot of problems, internal problems, crime and all that, had to now, step up their game in competition. Otherwise, they would be left out in the whole BRICS competition for the Chinese market. And so we see what might have been a center-right DA-led party slowly now moving to its admiration for a left-wing player and all of that. But anyway, it argues here also that it also argues that South Africa seems to also have been immune, nonetheless, to this whole pattern. The pattern of the fact that the gains, in trying to enter the Chinese market have not been universal. South Africa is an agricultural exception and a global player in the sector of agriculture, right? But then there's a concerning trend which has popped up in the growth of American fruit and nut exports to the other African countries as the heavily subsidized US producers look to divert their produce to alternative markets. Now, South Africa seems to be immune to that pattern, and it says that South Africa's import of these products from the US remained largely unchanged since before the trade war. So South Africa is still immune to the shock that actually then affected the US producers because of the ban on Chinese products. So now that US producers are now looking for alternative markets to export to because of the ban America had on China, South Africa still is a successful market to receive these exports. But at the same time, South Africa's position in the whole international trade wars is still strategic because it still has a safe landing in terms of exporting its heavy agricultural products to China and filling that opportunity which was open because of US's sanctions on China. And so that's why it appears that John Steenhuisen now has to really be smart in trying to really change the strategy for the Ministry of Agriculture in South Africa and really, work for the greater good of the nation in terms of exports and all that, rather than aligning strictly to, right-wing Western, narratives in that regard, and really, fight for that neutrality that South Africa actually stands in the global sphere of things. And I know because of the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, we know that South Africa has actually tried to maintain a neutral stand, in that it doesn't want to be left or right. It doesn't want to be for the West or for the East, but it just wants to be neutral and trade with whichever partners favor its greater good as a nation. And so that's why this report might actually seem strange to many of you. John Steenhuisen has slowly become an admirer of China. We could hear him speak, about, China has a lot to teach South Africa. There's a lot that can be emulated from China. This would be something that probably wouldn't have come out from the mouth of the DA leader prior to the government of national unity. But anyway, that's the nature of things in this world. We have to learn to be flexible and pragmatic whenever we find ourselves in some tight spots. But anyway, I don't know. What do you guys think about Steenhuisen's speech in this video? Share your thoughts in the comments.